Welcome to Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture, hosted by me, Alexandria Miller. Strictly Facts teaches the history, politics, and activism of the Caribbean and connects these themes to contemporary music and popular culture. Wantum people, welcome back to another episode of Strictly Facts, a guide to Caribbean history and culture. So far on Strictly Facts, we've aimed to discuss the histories of the Caribbean and its diaspora. We've mapped the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua to London, England, from Guyana to the Little Guyana neighborhood in New York. Today, we are talking about another very important site of Caribbean life and history in the diaspora. Depending on where you're from, you may call it the Six. So yes, you guessed it. Today we are talking about Canada. When I think of Caribana, when I think of all the trips that I spent as a kid in Canada, because I have so much family in Toronto, shout out to everybody back home. When I think of communities like Little Jamaica, we definitely had to shed light on the Caribbean-Canadian connection. So here with us today to discuss Caribbean-Canadian history is my friend, my sister, freshly minted, hot off the press, Dr. Marlene Gaynair. I'm so proud of you and your completion of your dissertation, Islands of the North, Recreating Jamaican Identities and Cultures in Toronto and New York City during the long 20th century. So Marlene, thank you so much for joining Strictly Facts today. Please introduce yourself. Tell us a bit about yourself, where in the Caribbean you rep, what you do, and how you got interested in that work.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I really appreciate it, Alex. I am a historian of the Black Atlantic with a particular focus on North America and the English-speaking Caribbean. I did my dissertation and my PhD studies at Rutgers University, New Brunswick. And in Toronto, I did my undergrad and my master's in history at York University. My family, I'm a Canadian of Jamaican descent. My parents are Jamaican. They immigrated during the 60s. And I like to tell people that even though I was born and raised in Toronto, I was definitely raised in a Jamaican household. And so just looking at my family, my extended family, my community, and just the long history and established culture of Jamaican and West Indian peoples in Toronto, I wanted to do a real study, demonstrated not just the obvious things like reggae music or Caribana, the annual Caribbean carnival, but the things that one would not normally think about when looking at the West Indian or Jamaican community, such as this cultural or political philanthropy and the establishment of a small business community. And so that really inspires and motivates my research interests in looking at diasporas and communities in urban North America, and really centering understudied places like Toronto when we speak about the Caribbean diaspora.
Beautifully said and welcome again. So, first off, I want to clear up one very popular misconception about the Caribbean population in Canada. People may think it's just Jamaicans in Canada, in Toronto specifically, for whatever reason, but that is actually false. People from across the Caribbean have migrated to Canada. However, Jamaicans made up one of the largest groups very early on, as far back as the 1790s. So, can you talk to us briefly about that history, what prompted that rather forced migration, etc.?
Certainly. So thank you for mentioning the 1700s. The Black presence in Canada is at least over 400 years. And what we know as Canada today, it was a land, unceded territory of the First Nations. And of course, British North America had colonies. So before there was the Dominion of Canada in 1867, there were the minor colonies of Upper Canada, Lower Canada, Nova Scotia, and other places, especially when you look at how the British won the war against the French and took over places like what we know as Quebec and the Maritimes. And so in 1796, when the Trelawney Maroons lost the Second Maroon War, the British, I guess you could say, armed forces basically exiled them. I would have to say exiled to Nova Scotia because it wasn't a well developed or populated British colony. And climate wise, it was a vast difference from, the tropical Caribbean to the cold and frightening North Atlantic. And so eventually, 2 years later, they left to Sierra Leone. Some stayed, along with the Black loyalists, who were formerly enslaved people that escaped the United States during the Revolutionary War. And there were a lot of migrants, not so much a lot numerically, but different people from the African diaspora that settled and lived and worked in what we know as Canada from coast to coast, from Vancouver to Halifax. Despite the anti Blackness, the racism, the lack of resources that one would find in the 18th century, 19th century. And there were a lot of barriers, not just along the border, but just through immigration policies and citizenship policies that also made it difficult to legally migrate to Canada. In fact, after the Civil War in the United States, so many, at least 60% of African Americans or the Black population left, So as we go into the 20th century, there were particular employers that were able to bring a lot of West Indians into the country, such as people from Barbados and Jamaica and others, to work in the coal mines, from the railway porters that you see employed West Indian and Black Canadian men straight through to the mid-century. And numbers were not as explosive like in the United States because, as a British colony in the Caribbean, Canada wasn't necessarily the first choice. Most people wanted to go to England as English subjects and citizens because you were able to work, travel, and settle freely, but also, it's a part of the culture, part of the Commonwealth or the empire. So you see these population demographic figures for Black Canada changing throughout the 50s and 60s until the huge, massive explosion during the 70s. And this also takes place simultaneously in the United States.
Thank you for that's like very vast and expansive history. You've covered a lot of my questions just in that very brief bit. Shifting then to this sort of 20th century moment, right? What were some of the reasons for this uptick in Caribbean migration? I have one figure here that says, from having very low numbers throughout the 1800s and the first half of the 1900s, but at one point, by 1971, there were 68,000 West Indian born residents in Canada, and another 140,000 that follow in that decade. So what were some of the reasons for this uptick?
Great question. Well, during the 20th century, like I said, many people from the English-speaking Caribbean or the British colonies of the Caribbean actively migrated to the UK. And after the British Parliament passed the Commonwealth Immigrants Act in 1971, it basically shut the doors of open migration for what we now call the Windrush generation, named after the Empire Windrush, which docked at Tilbury Docks in London, 1948. So the increase in migration and movement to Canada and the United States really coincides in the post-war period. After World War II, when the United States and Canada are really trying to demonstrate this sense of being a global leader or at the forefront of democracy for the West. And this was an opportunity for Canada, particularly, to stand out as an independent nation outside of the British Empire, as an independent place that was an ideal place for the world, definitely in contrast to the United States. That's very much a part of the Canadian myth making. And unfortunately, the immigration policies and citizenship policies did not catch up to this rhetoric coming from the Canadian government. It wasn't until the 50s that you started seeing commissions and real debate about removing these racist policies from the country's Immigration Act. And under these, I guess, democratic or progressive governments and also the social movements, you see these changes happening, but it culminates in the Immigration Act in 1967, which is also Canada's centennial. And demonstratively, unfortunately, I should mention, the Canadian census and their other demographics were really not concise or race-based until the late 20th century. And so when we look at the statistics, it's often the Caribbean and Bermuda or Negroes or West Indies. So it doesn't really say anything island specific. And it doesn't really look at West Indians who might have migrated to England first or migrated to the US and then came to Canada. So this only accounts for the people who are enumerated or volunteer this information, not this, underground or unspoken movement. So like you mentioned, because of these changes or the removal of overt racist policies, you see this jump in migration, something like 12,000 in 1961 to 68,000 in 1971 to 173,000 in 1981. So you have these pull factors, better opportunities in terms of employment, education, the proximity to the West Indies. And then you also have factors like, for instance, in Jamaica and Guyana, you have this shift from democracy to a socialist democratic government. And you also have the OPEC oil embargo in the 70s, this recession that hits. And so these are factors that push a lot of people from the Caribbean to the United States and to Canada, especially since the doors are pretty much closed to England, to the UK. So Canada becomes a more popular place to live, especially as the West Indian Jamaican population in Toronto is growing.
Thank you so much for, centering the sort of diaspora histories that really lead to this uptick in migration. So, could you really talk about how Canada eventually becomes this major part of the Caribbean diaspora? So, we have this uptick in migration, but what are neighborhoods like? Like, what is happening at this time to really build the communities?
I think it's important to really look at the gendered way of migration and also how it is affected by class, because this also determines when and how people from the Caribbean, men, women, and children, were able to gain entry into Canada. Initially, it was easier for people with a skilled trade that Canada needed. So early in the 20th century, you saw a lot of perhaps nurses, teachers, lawyers. You also saw people on student visas. So if you can get entry to one of these schools, then you're already in Canada. That was a path to permanent resident status or citizenship. But I think what is important to know is that you have a lot of this chain migration that's happening. Either the mother or father, or even extended family members, such as grandma or auntie or uncle, that first come to Canada or come to settle in Toronto, and then later sponsor family members. And when these family members arrive, they can sponsor others. It really created this barrel generation where remittances are a huge part of a country's GDP, or sending barrels to support family members. There's constantly movement and migration once West Indians are able to plant their roots in the north in Canada. And this, of course, as planting roots means establishing a community, this sense of permanence, you start to see the establishment of small businesses.
Thank you so much for, summarizing that very important history of some of the leading factors that led to this uptick in migration. I guess my question now is, thinking of how Canada ultimately becomes, a central place for the Caribbean diaspora, how do some of these networks start to begin developing amongst, Caribbean women, Caribbean families, etc., within Canada?
That's a great question. I believe that immigration from the Caribbean, this includes the French or English speaking Caribbean, it definitely is affected by gender, by race, ethnicity, and class. And this also happens and changes, shifts over the long 20th century. So in the beginning, you might see more of a professional class that migrates, including nurses, lawyers, professors, priests, or preachers. And you might also find young men and women who arrive on student visas, attending McGill or University of Toronto. We have a program started by the Canadian government in 1910, 1911 that recruited over 100 women from Guadeloupe to become domestics in Montreal. And this ended early because, according to white households, that Black women were too uppity, they didn't listen, they were rude. Uh, this could be debated. In 1955, the Canadian government starts the West Indian Domestic Scheme, which is about attracting young women from the Anglo-Caribbean. Basically, to be eligible, women had to be single, between 18 and 35 years of age, to have a minimum 8th grade education, and to pass a medical examination. Basically, these women, these Black women, were subjected to this moral scrutiny, based on their womanhood and their race, which other applicants did not have to go through. So this Canadian government program was also with the cooperation of the Jamaican government and other West Indian governments. So it wasn't just a program that recruited over 1,600 women until 1967, but one that also provided another route into Canada for these young Black women. So, for instance, we have the Honorable Jean Augustine, who was a member of Parliament for decades, also the parliamentary assistant to Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. She came through the domestic scheme in 1960 from Grenada. She was already an elementary school teacher, but she wanted to advance her career, her education, by coming to Canada. And so when she arrived in Montreal, she already had her landed status, if you will, her citizenship, which allowed her to move to Toronto, go back to school through University of Toronto, and be a beacon of hope to establish this growing Black West Indian community in Toronto and in Canada. And the Honorable Jean Augustine, she represents an entire generation of young Black women from the Caribbean who came to Canada when, you might see one or two other Black people on the streets of Toronto, but through this migration, were able to plant their roots and sponsor other family members. This chain migration that fortified and strengthened the networks and connection between Canada and the Jamaican diaspora.
And so from there, we're seeing this growth in the population. And then, I immediately think of communities like Little Jamaica being built, right? So as these networks begin to grow, what are some of the ways that West Indian people in Canada are developing their communities, building relationships, building their own businesses, etc.?
Great question. So I'll start with Little Jamaica, which is in Midtown Toronto, Ontario. It is along Eglinton Avenue West, which is a thoroughfare that goes east-west. It bisects Toronto. And in the early 1960s, you start to see certain businesses spring up, mostly grocery stores and bakeries, food-related places like Spence's Bakery, which I found in a small Black community paper called Contrast in Toronto. And you see ads advertising hardo bread, beef patties, gazada, all of the delicacies we're used to in Jamaica. You also see grocery stores, right, that are importing fruits and vegetables and foodstuffs that were not widely available, but also creating spaces, Black spaces, where West Indians could feel wanted and welcomed. And this is their space. You're creating place out of a white space. The majority of these small businesses tended to be restaurants and nightclubs, but you also have barber shops, beauty shops, record shops, clothing shops, all types of things that really cover this larger lived experience, not dedicated to a certain class or gender, but something that was inherently for West Indians, but also created this or establish this larger Black presence in Toronto, but also Canada itself. And within this space of Little Jamaica, and as the population grows and disperses through Toronto, you start to see members of the community form organizations, cultural organizations, such as the Jamaican-Canadian Association. You have the National Black Women's Association, a lot of like 60 to 70 different cultural and ethnic organizations in Toronto in the 70s and 80s, really representing the diversity of our culture, of our people. And this also transcends to this philanthropy, supporting one another, not just in Toronto or in Canada, but also throughout the Caribbean diaspora. Those of us giving back to fund and support schools, remittances, all of these things which strengthen the economy back home, but also keep us connected. Little Jamaica in Toronto, which not only represents Jamaicans, but also the Anglo-Caribbean. You can compare it to Crown Heights in Brooklyn, certain places on Nostrand Avenue, which the city councilors named Little Caribbean. You also have these small businesses where West Indians decided to settle and migrate, which expanded the culture, all of these streets, which are now known as, the center of Caribbean life. Of course, similar and parallel to Toronto, as the population grows larger, as time moves on in the 20th century, you also see other communities established, such as in the Bronx, in Queens. And in Toronto, you have it in the suburbs like Mississauga, Brampton, Ajax, Scarborough. So you really see the changes over time when you look at the geography of Toronto and New York and these other spaces.
And even to add to your point on geography and changes over time, I have to give a big shout out to my dear friend, writer, filmmaker. She does all the things, Shireen Taylor, who made a wonderful, beautiful documentary called Talawa Abroad on gentrification in Little Jamaica and how, what was once a burgeoning and blossoming Caribbean community of Caribbean businesses and things of that nature, has sort of in effect been going through the struggles of having to face potential destruction due to things like the light rail, etc., and how that's obviously affecting Caribbean life.
Right. And I'm sure, people in Brooklyn right now could say the same thing, especially during this pandemic and the rising costs of rent. You see a lot of Brooklyn being gentrified, a lot of Crown Heights being gentrified. And what happens when the heart of the community, the center of the community starts to disappear? When peoples are displaced, where do they go? You know, um, Obviously our culture won't die, but what are we going to lose? What's going to happen? And I suppose time will tell, but what are we going to do in the meantime? And I guess that's a story for another day.
Talking about that latter 20th century point, so we've got this bustling Caribbean community growing in Canada. How does the Canadian government respond to this massive growth of, Black life, for over 100 plus years was a very white space?
That's a good question. I believe most scholars of Canada or Canadian history would agree with me by saying this settler state, this white settler colony, now known as Canada, was really established or built in comparison or as a contrast to the United States as a white space, as opposed to the United States, which had a large, formerly enslaved Black population. The saying of the Great White North does not only include the climate, but the wanted and protected white demographic of, of the Canadian population. And so, similar to other dominions in the British Empire, such as New Zealand, Australia, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, in what we now know as Canada, wanted to protect this white population by using racist policies, which would prevent or make it difficult for people from Asia or Africa and the Caribbean from settling or working in the country. So the supported immigration policies, such as having the domestic scheme or recruiting people from Barbados to work in the coal mines in Nova Scotia, or the Canadian National Railway working with the government to recruit West Indians to be railway porters. As long as there's some type of, it seems, financial need, then there are exceptions made. But I make sure to differentiate by saying not just Canada, but particularly because Canada isn't a person. The Canadian government, you see from the early 1900s, Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier, who was the first French-speaking and Catholic prime minister, under his parliament, order in council was passed in 1911 that said, for a period of 1 year from and after the date hereof, the landing in Canada shall be, and the same is prohibited of any immigrants belonging to the Negro race, which race is deemed unsuitable to the climate and requirements of Canada, end quote. So even though this order in council was not invoked officially and it wasn't incorporated into the Immigration Act, it's also an indication of where the Canadian politicians and society wanted to go, what their idea of a Canadian could be. And it is by preventing Black settlement in Canada.
Your dissertation also touches on the ways that like youth were affected at, various lengths, whether that was through policing or through school policies. Could you tell us a bit about that as well? I know I got like first dibs to your dissertation, so
Yeah, definitely. Look out for that book in 2027 whenever it
have to
gets
speak it into existence. I support you.
Yes, yes. For youth, this is a really important question. Thank you for asking. When we really look at the growth of the Black population or the Caribbean population, as we head towards the end of the 20th century and moving into the 21st, Canadian Census or Statistics Canada says that the majority of our Black population is a young population. And it makes sense when you think about, the generations before us that migrated here, their children that were born here became Canadian citizens. And so through settlement and migration, you start to see this explosion in population and growth. So in particular, many, not necessarily historical studies, but ones written by sociologists or other disciplines, you learn that this, I guess, young people moving into the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, they were in a rock and a hard place. Yes, you were born in Canada, but you were also a Black person in Canada. There's also this generational gap of your parents being immigrants and living in a certain way that's blended with, Canadian and Caribbean cultures and experiences, but also now you are a young person born in Canada. It's not Black space, and what these difficulties might mean for you. It might mean that you go into public school and you're dealing with a racist institutions, from the classroom to the teacher to the administrators. It might mean that because you are not understood when you're speaking your Creole or your other languages from the Caribbean, they assume you cannot speak English and then you are held back a grade. You also have the increase in police violence with law enforcement, where you had at least 10 Black men and at least a couple women who are murdered or shot by Toronto police forces, Toronto police services. And then out of this, I would say this trauma or this discrimination and tension, you see the rise of a hybridized identity and culture, one that blends your Caribbean roots and ethnicity with what you are experiencing as a person of Canadian descent. So this Caribbean Canadian identity is really manifested and created by young people through music, through language, through fashion. Our hybridized identity goes through music when we think about hip hop, when we think about soca or other, cultural forms. And most people can see it today when you see pop star rapper Drake saying certain things like Wagwan or what have you, vernacular from Jamaican Creole patois in his everyday speech. So we don't want to call this Toronto slang. We want to make sure we represent the roots. This is Black Caribbean diasporic language, protected, manifested, and spoken by the Black Caribbean youth, but also, you know how it is. Black culture, Black popular culture is popular and taken and used and distorted by everyone. And so the contributions, right? The contributions in Canada and Toronto are not just from elders or older people, but from the bottom up, from 0 to 100. And I think that's very important. Canada doesn't have to copy nobody else, doesn't have to copy the United States. Toronto doesn't have to copy New York or London. The establishment of the community through migration, through language, through food, through everything is what creates a unique diasporic experience.
That was so beautifully said. I thank you for sharing that with us. Something that you said, especially bringing up hip hop, Canadian hip hop, obviously brought to my mind my favorite Strictly Facts question. And so, as you give us your favorite example of Caribbean Canadian pop culture, could you also talk to us about what that hip hop generation has looked like for Canada?
So in the 1980s, during what I was saying before, this Black youth culture, where with the development of a vernacular, with the music and all of this good stuff, you also see these diasporic connections being reinforced and happening. When a student from Ryerson University in Toronto, Ron Nelson, who was a Jamaican Canadian, when he started to promote his radio show, Fantastic Voyage, and produce these large hip hop spectacles, you also saw a lot of foundational hip hop artists like Karis One and Boogie Down Productions, Biz Markie and Roxanne Shante also come visit Toronto and, collaborate with local artists. And so I feel like the best song to really represent this moment. And so I have to give a shout out to Me, Michelle McCullough, who was the first Canadian rapper to sign with a US label, First Priority, releases her LP and single Jamaican Funk Canadian Style in 1991. And yeah, this is foundational to, I think, Toronto's music of the African diaspora. And why I love Mishimi is because she was really around for the development. She's so much a part of the development of this Black youth culture, the music culture, which we see in the 80s and 90s into the 21st century, where she would perform. Like she would battle New York rappers like Sugar Love. And you can see this on YouTube if you search, where when she went on stage, she would, rap or freestyle in this Canadian African American vernacular English style. And then when she hit the bridge, she would rock out with her Jamaican patois for 16 bars. And that's when the crowd went wild. And she really embraced her cultures. Yes, she's Jamaican. Yes, she's Canadian. So she doesn't forget her roots. She brings everything together. And I feel this is really what represents people of Caribbean descent in Toronto, right? This is a visual and verbal way of expressing what it means to really embrace both sides, to really embrace Canada and the Caribbean, for better or worse.
Way I go. Stay tuned for Strictly Fact Sounds, where we connect our history to pop culture. Our Strictly Facts sound session for this episode crosses so many different genres of Caribbean Canadian work. First, of course, shout out to Marlene for putting us onto Michi Me and her 1991 single Jamaican Funk Canadian Style, who, as Marlene mentioned, is a critical voice for Canada's golden age of hip hop. Next, we'd be remiss to mention Michi Me and not mention one of her self-proclaimed influences, Jamaican-born Canadian dub poet and educator Lillian Allen, and her dub poem Rub-a-Dub in a Regent Park, which can be found recorded on her 2011 album Revolutionary Tea Party. In it, she describes residents of Toronto's housing project, Regent Park, and their experiences with discrimination and injustice, while also connecting these experiences to legacies of enslavement. And lastly, there were a number of novels to choose from. Be sure to check out Bayesian author Austin Clarke's series, The Toronto Trilogy, first starting with the book The Meeting Point, which details West Indian women's experiences in the domestic scheme and was published in 1967. Thank you so much, Marlene, for joining Strictly Facts today. It was such a pleasure having you to talk about that Caribbean-Canadian connection. So please let everyone know where they can find you and your amazing work on social media.
Thank you so much for having me. Definitely check me out online. You can visit my website, which is an ongoing archive of Blackness in Toronto and soon other spaces in the US and Canada. It is islandsinthenorth.com. That's all one word. And if you like memes and historical stuff, definitely check me out on Twitter at BLK Atlantic CDN. That is at blackatlantic.cdn. Holla at your girl. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you for listening. Again, Marlene, thank you for joining. Links to Marlene's social media will, of course, be in the show notes. So definitely make sure to check her out. I co-sign that she is hilarious. So you will be definitely seeing funny memes and all the historical things from her. So thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Little more. Thanks for tuning in to Strictly Facts. Visit strictlyfactspodcast.com for more information from each episode. Follow us at Strictly Facts Pod on Instagram and Facebook and at Strictly Facts PD on Twitter.